With a 19mm socket, remove all these plastic nuts that hold on your hubcap, if you have this. Remove the hubcap, and then with a 19mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then take the wheel off. Next, I want to remove this nut. Because it's in such poor condition, I'm going to try and heat it up first to hopefully give it the best chance it has to coming loose. But be careful when you heat up things right next to the strut, because this is a pressurized strut here, so you don't want to heat up the strut too much. I'm trying to focus on heating up the nut itself. Okay, let's get an 18mm socket on there. Try to take this nut off, or at least break it free. It's not off, but it did break free. So the next thing I want to do is use some locking pliers on the back side here. Now, this is most likely going to ruin the boot, but I always recommend doing sway bar links when they're in this condition if you have to replace the struts. Get these as tight as possible. Let's try again. All right, that did the trick. Next, right over here, if you follow the caliper and the brake hose, you'll see this 10mm nut. You'll need to loosen this so that we can pull this bracket away from the knuckle. Just loosen it up a few turns. You don't need to take it all the way off. This is plenty. And then with a small hammer, tap on the end of the stud. That'll push it through and basically unlock this bracket from the knuckle. Just like that. This comes out. Now we have a lot more slack on the brake hose. Next, I want to remove these 2 strut bolts here. 18mm socket. You don't have to hold the bolt side because it's pressed into the knuckle. Take this bracket off, which is supposed to be one piece, and it's also supposed to hold this right here. Obviously this doesn't. So next I'm going to put the nuts back on flush with the end of the bolts. That way I can drive these bolts through and not damage the threads. Take both of the nuts back off, and without hitting the threads, drive the bolts through the rest of the way. Now you can wiggle the knuckle, remove the bolts, let the knuckle drop. It shouldn't go too far. Separate the two, push the strut out of the way. At the top you have 3 13mm nuts that hold the strut on. I'm going to take the first 2 off, and then on the last one I'm going to leave the last one over here. I have to hold the strut, otherwise it'll fall right out. Typically at this point you'd want to go underneath and hold the strut, which I will, but I have a suspicion that this is not going to come right out because it's so rusted in here. So I'm going to remove this nut. I am holding the strut on the bottom, but I doubt it's going to come off. Yeah, so it's stuck in here, which is exactly what I thought. Because that's the case, I'm going to start these 3 mounting nuts back on, just a few threads, and then I'm going to use a hammer this down. Hopefully it'll break free, but the nuts will stop it from completely falling out. There we go. So now it's free. I'm going to take these 2 off. And when it comes to this one, I'm going to leave this one up here, take it out, and slide the strut out through the bottom. There it is. I have my strut set up in a spring compressor. This is the best and the safest way to do it. You don't want to take this top nut off and release the spring with nothing holding this together. And they make other devices, but they're not as safe as this. So make sure you're safe with this, because this can severely hurt you. And now I'm going to compress the spring. I can see that the strut inside is loose. With a 21mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove this nut. It might not work, and I'll show you what to do in that case, but I'll give it a shot. So it broke free, but it's not coming off. That's okay. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to take this boot, slide it down, get the largest locking pliers that you have, and lock them on as tight as you can, as high as you can on the shaft of the shock, or of the strut. The reason why you want the biggest ones as well, because they have the most grip, and the reason why you want to go as high as possible is so that if the shaft gets damaged, which it most likely will have some marks on it, it's never going to go down and hit the seal inside of the strut assembly down there, so you won't damage the shock absorber part of the strut. And lock them on as tight as possible. Oh, okay, let's try again. There we go, easy peasy. Now you can take this strut mount, remove it, and remove this bearing as well. Clean up the area if it needs to be cleaned up. Set the new bearing on here, and then put the strut mount on. Start on the nut. Now let's tighten it on as much as possible. The reason I say that is because the same thing is going to happen. It's going to want to spin, so I'll have to put some locking pliers on it. Nice and tight, and snug this all up. At this point, as you release the strut, make sure that the spring is still positioned where it needs to be, and it's basically there's a little spot here that the spring end has to sit on. There we go, that's just seated. Release it from your device, and then we can install it into the vehicle. When you put in the new strut, you'll notice that it has a flat side right here. That needs to go towards the engine bay, so the slope of it needs to be facing out. Slide the new one in, line it up with all of the holes for the studs. I have my mounting hardware already here so that I can start at least one nut and let go of it. Start all of them in. I'm going to snug these up, but I won't torque them yet. You want to torque these with the weight of the vehicle on the ground or on the suspension. Still a 13mm socket, bottom them out. We'll leave it like this for now, and then we'll come back and torque it at the end. Bring the knuckle up and line it up with the strut. Slide in one of the bolts. Push the knuckle in and line up the top one. Punch that one through. On this side there was this bracket that went in here. Unfortunately mine is broken, but I'm still going to put the pieces in here because they also act as a washer and spacer here. So I'm going to put them back regardless. And I'm going to put on the two mounting nuts, and then we can bottom these out and torque them to 89 foot-pounds. You want to keep tightening so that the bolt gets sucked through all the way. .89 foot-pounds. That's it right there. Take your soy bar link, slide it through the strut, put the nut on, bottom it out, and the torque is 48 foot-pounds. I'm most likely already there, but I'm going to torque it anyway. And there you have it. One last thing is to put this bracket back in here. As you can see, I put some anti-seize on the bolt in there, on the stud. Hopefully it won't seize up in the future if I do that. And now you can just tighten the nut, and as you tighten the nut, it's supposed to pull the stud through and basically clamp this whole bracket onto the strut. Don't over tighten it, just make it nice and snug, and make sure that this bracket is secured on here, which it is, so that's perfect. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Grab your hubcap, if you have one, and line it up with the valve stem. There's a hole here for it, otherwise the valve stem will get crushed and probably this won't even line up. So go ahead and line that up, and then thread in the little caps. This is what holds on your hubcap. And I prefer doing these by hand because if you over tighten them, which is very easy to do with a power tool, then they just strip out and then your hubcap goes flying off while you're driving, which is not great. So make those nice and snug by hand. The torque for these is only 18 foot-pounds, so now that everything's back together and the car's on the ground, let's torque them. Perfect. And now you can road test it down to your local alignment shop and get a professional alignment.